When the world fell silent and his enemies surrounded him, he didn't pick up a sword, he picked up a harp. This is not just the story of a king, this is the sound of a soul singing in the dark. Welcome to Midnight Psalms, where we uncover the secret songs whispered in the shadows. Psalms written not in palaces but in caves, not in comfort but in crisis. If you've ever prayed in the dark, this story is for you. There are nights when the darkness doesn't just fill the room, it fills your chest, it wraps around your throat and makes it hard to breathe, and that's exactly where David found himself, not as a king but as a fugitive hiding in caves, hunted by the very man whose throne he never tried to steal, and in those echoing chambers of cold rock and deeper fear, he did something no warrior would have expected. He sang. He took his trembling hands and touched the strings not of violence but of worship, and in the belly of despair a melody was born, not crafted in joy but forged in pain, not designed to entertain but to survive, and while the world outside called him a rebel, a threat, a mistake, heaven listened and whispered back, "I hear you." This was not the David of triumph, not the boy who killed Goliath or the warrior praised in the streets. This was the David who bled on the inside, whose friends betrayed him, whose king threw spears instead of trust, who had no bed, no warmth, no throne, only a promise whispered long ago, and the echo of it now felt like a joke. And yet, he still sang because songs weren't just art to him, they were weapons, they were shields, they were his way of not going numb, of not forgetting who he was, of not letting pain define him more than purpose. And in that cave, with fear breathing down his neck, he wrote psalms not for royalty but for survival. Every chord he struck was a cry, every verse a confession, every note a prayer too messy for religion but too raw to ignore, because David didn't need polished lyrics. He needed truth, and that truth sounded like tears, like anger, like begging, and somehow still like hope, the kind of hope that doesn't wear a crown but carries a cross. And if you've ever felt like your prayers were too broken, too angry, too real, listen. Because David's weren't soft either, they were loud enough to rattle caves and soft enough to make heaven weep, because darkness doesn't scare God, silence does. This wasn't worship in a temple, it was worship in a war zone, the war not outside but within, and while David could have picked bitterness or revenge, he picked vulnerability, he handed God his confusion, his rage, his fear, and in doing so he invited every person after him to do the same, not to perform for God but to collapse into him, to stop pretending and start bleeding honestly in his presence, because David didn't write psalms to impress. He wrote them to survive, and they did long after his enemies fell, long after his tears dried. And maybe that's what singing in the dark does. It doesn't change the cave around you, but it changes what happens inside of you. It turns fear into sound, and sound into defiance, not against God but against giving up, against losing yourself in the sorrow, against surrendering to silence. And David's voice, though cracked and tired, refused to be swallowed by the walls, because when you sing in the night, even if your voice shakes, the darkness listens, and sometimes, just sometimes, it trembles. What if the real throne David was called to wasn't gold or glory, but the authority to feel, to break, to be human in front of God and not be dismissed, to lead not with perfection but with permission, permission for others to be undone too, because kings build kingdoms, but David built bridges between broken hearts and a listening God, and that's what made him dangerous, not his sword, but his vulnerability. His worship wasn't a performance, it was resistance, and every time he sang, hell lost a little ground. In those hidden moments, David gave language to pain, to confusion, to the question that haunts so many, where are you, God? And unlike most leaders, he didn't hide his doubt, he turned it into lyrics, into art, into something holy, not because it was perfect but because it was real. And when you read his psalms today, they still echo with that same honesty, the kind that doesn't give you answers but gives you a mirror. And in that reflection you see yourself, not alone, not crazy, not weak, just human, deeply human. David's psalms weren't written with the luxury of peace. They were written in chaos, while running, while bleeding, while losing, and maybe that's what gives them power, not that they ignore pain, but that they invite it into the presence of God, not to fix it quickly but to feel it fully, because faith isn't about pretending you're fine. It's about dragging your pain into the light of a God who can handle it, who doesn't flinch at your questions, who doesn't run from your darkness. And maybe that's why David was called a man after God's heart, not because he always got it right, but because he always brought it all. The darkness never silenced him. It refined him, it didn't destroy his faith, it stripped it, like fire to gold, like wind to flame, and each time he sang, it wasn't an escape from suffering, it was an embrace of something deeper, something that pain couldn't touch. And that's the invitation his story leaves us with, to sing anyway, to write your psalm even if your voice breaks, to bring your cracked hallelujah to the cave and believe that it still matters, that it's still heard, even if the echo is the only answer. What if the most powerful worship isn't the kind that fills arenas, but the kind that fills a cave with trembling notes, just enough to keep your soul alive? Because David's worship wasn't loud in volume, it was loud in truth, and that truth didn't always sound pretty. Sometimes it was ugly, raw, soaked in doubt and desperation, and still, God called it holy still. God called it His, and that should change the way we see our own prayers, the way we approach God, not with perfect grammar but with honest groans, because sometimes the deepest worship is the sound of someone refusing to let silence have the last word. And there's something about singing in the dark that builds a kind of intimacy no daylight can create, a trust that's carved not from miracles but from misery, and David learned that trust the hard way, when promises felt like lies and victory looked impossible, but still he returned to the harp, to the psalm, to the song, because the song wasn't about feeling good, it was about remembering what was still true, even when nothing felt true. Even when his soul screamed the opposite, he chose to sing not because of what he felt but because of who he knew. His cave became a cathedral not because it changed shape but because he changed posture, and in that place of isolation something sacred happened. Worship stopped being an event and started being a lifeline, a rope he clung to when everything else was slipping. And maybe that's what we miss sometimes. We think worship is a genre, but to David it was oxygen, and each note he released into the dark air was like saying, "I'm still here. I still believe, even now." Those songs weren't meant to be chart toppers. They were confessions, spiritual survival journals written in melodies, and that's why they still matter, because they weren't for a stage, they were for the soul. And when you read Psalm 13 or Psalm 142, you're not hearing a performance. You're hearing a cry, you're feeling a wound that didn't close easily, and maybe yours hasn't either, and that's okay. Because God isn't scared of your unfinished stories or your unanswered prayers, He's just waiting for your real voice. And David's real voice didn't always sound victorious. Sometimes it sounded like, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever?" And the beauty is, he didn't edit that part out, he left it in because he knew that God could handle it. And if David, the future king, the giant slayer, the man after God's heart, could say those words, then maybe you can too. Maybe it's okay to bring your raw and real into the presence of God without fear, without shame, without filters, and trust that your midnight voice matters just as much as your morning praise. In a world that tells you to only show your highlight reel, David gave us the opposite. A collection of laments, breakdowns, doubts, and worship, all wrapped in one heart. And somehow, God used that to shape not just a king but a generation of worshipers. Because we don't learn how to worship from success stories, we learn from scars, and David's scars weren't hidden, they were sung, and that's why we remember him, not for his victories but for his vulnerability. If you're walking through your own cave right now, hear this. You don't have to wait for the light to start singing, you don't have to have it all figured out before you start praying, you don't need answers to write your own psalm. All you need is breath and the courage to use it, even if it sounds more like weeping than worship, because in God's kingdom, that still counts, and your whisper is louder than you think, especially in the ears of heaven. David teaches us that sometimes worship is just staying when you want to run, singing when you want to shut down, writing when you feel numb, lifting your eyes even if they're still full of tears, and that's not weakness, that's holy resistance. That's the kind of faith that hell can't shake, because it wasn't built in comfort, it was born in caves. And when you choose to sing in the dark, you declare that your pain won't have the final word, your praise will. So if the only thing you can do today is whisper a single word toward the ceiling, do it, and let it be your psalm, your hallelujah in the rubble, your melody in the silence, because someone needs to hear what you'll write in the dark. Someone one day will sing the song you're writing with your tears, just like we sing David's now, and just like him, your broken notes might become someone else's freedom, because songs don't die when they're written in the fire, they echo forever. And if this story reached you in your own night season, let it be a quiet reminder that you are not forgotten, you are not abandoned, and even now, even here, your voice still matters. So write, sing, whisper, cry, but whatever you do, don't stay silent, because when David sang to the darkness didn't win. If this spoke to your soul, take a deep breath and share it with someone else who's sitting in a cave of their own. And when you're ready, write your psalm. You're always welcome here at Midnight Psalms.